Woolies announces a big jump in profit but faces a growing problem with shoplifting. Sexual harassment still rife across the country. And Domino's boss admits he pushed pizza prices too high. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Thursday, the 24th of August, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, your interview today is a really interesting chat with Dia Jolly, who is the Chief Product Officer at Xero.
Yes, so it's all about what small businesses want and what they wanted 5 years ago, what they want now, and what they're likely to want in 5 years' time. Plenty about digitisation. Obviously, that has taken off during the COVID years and post-COVID years and what that means for small businesses. Also, plenty about cash flow and things like that. It's a really interesting chat just to get underneath the bonnet of the small business community.
Yeah, it is a good one. And Dia is normally based in the US. She's in Australia just for a couple of days as part of the XeroCon, the big conference for Xero. It's on in Sydney yesterday and today. And Xero is a great supporter of Fear and Greed. So that is coming up a little bit later on. The main story this morning, Sean, Woolworths share price jumped nearly 5% yesterday after the grocer announced a $3.1 billion pre-tax profit, thanks in part to higher profit margins in food.
And like we heard from Coles yesterday, the profit was somewhat offset by a higher rate of theft. Overall, Woolies said the supermarket side of the business is doing well, but consumers are pulling back spending at Big W, particularly around small appliances. Boss Brad Banducci said inflation is showing promising signs of moderation, but wages and energy and transport inflation is still putting pressure on costs. He said theft spiked in the March quarter. Now, most of the stealing came from Big W, particularly around razor blades and health and beauty products. Banducci added that theft in New Zealand supermarkets is a serious problem, as is aggression towards staff. That's been on the rise in New Zealand. Now, total sales were more than $64 billion for the full year, and the group profit was up 13.7%. Sounds good. It does if you're a shareholder, but it brings a challenge for Banducci and for Woolies. Critics claim that supermarkets are gouging customers. When you see such a big jump in profits and profit margins, well, that adds a little fuel to that fire.
Yeah, it may not be the best look then, is it? So, Sean, we are about, 2/3 of the way through profit reporting season? Well, I sound so confident saying that. I'm just trying to calculate it in my head. It would be about 2/3, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
What do we know so far?
So consumers are definitely hurting. They're looking for better deals. We've seen that in the Woolies and Coles results, for example. Inflation is moderating. That's very good news. Price pressures aren't the main topic of conversation. They certainly were 6 months ago. There isn't as much discussion this earnings season about staffing and staff shortages and that type of thing. So that's good news. Some companies with pricing power, like Woolies, have been able to expand margins. Investors love that, though customers don't necessarily agree. And the global economy outside China isn't too bad. Companies operating in the US and or Australia, think of the buildings companies, a lot of those industrials companies, they're just not reporting a massive fall-off in demand. Things are definitely softer, but the recession everyone has predicted might still be some way off. I would say overall, this has probably been a bit better in terms of earnings seasons than people expected.
That is good news. How did local markets perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed the day up 0.4% to 7,148 points. It would have been quite a bit better, but for a sell-off in the final few minutes of trading. The iron ore miners did well on the back of rising prices. Fortescue Metals and Rio Tinto jumped 2.5%. BHP was up nearly 2%. The banks were higher, led by Westpac, which rose 1.3%. Wesfarmers also did well, probably on the back of that Woolies result.
And international markets, what's going on there?
The rise of Nvidia on Wall Street continues, with the chip maker hitting a new high yesterday morning ahead of its results announcement. Now, Nvidia is up 220% this year. At its peak yesterday, at its new record, it accounted for nearly 3.2% of all of the S&P 500. Only Apple, Microsoft, Google and Amazon are larger. Now, of course, Nvidia with those four, all tech companies. In commodity markets, oil prices are up a bit. The Aussie dollar jumped on the back of those higher iron ore prices I mentioned. It's now trading around 64.5 US cents.
All right, there's a bit to cover. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. In politics, Sean, it feels like this is a big week for policy, really. Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers yesterday announced a review of national competition rules in an effort to boost sagging productivity.
Ahead of the release of the intergenerational report today, Chalmers said a task force into competition policy will be supported by a panel of experts, including Chief Executive of the Grattan Institute, Danielle Wood, and former Chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, Rod Sims. The Treasurer said the review will look at competition laws, policies and institutions to ensure they remain fit for purpose. The government says an update to competition law is needed to ensure the country can make the most of digitalisation, the growth in services, the net zero transformation, and provide support to the nation's most vulnerable. It will consider proposals put forward by the ACCC around merger reform as well as other competition law issues. It'll be a big undertaking, though it will take a couple of years before we get any outcomes.
And the Treasurer also had a bit to say, Sean, about weakness in the Chinese economy.
Chalmers said it is a substantial risk for the global economic outlook, which is locked into a tug of war between resilience and risk. On the resilience side, the American economy has held up especially well. The banking system has held up better than expected. Inflation is moderating. That's according to Jim Chalmers. He added, but there are risks as well. Some of those are geopolitical, Russia, Ukraine. But the softening of the Chinese economy is one of the risks that certainly we're most attentive to, and that the global economy is watching most closely.
And staying in Canberra briefly, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said he'll announce the date for the Voice to Parliament vote in Adelaide next week.
Yes, the favourite date, according to the bookmakers, is October 14. Now, yesterday, Jim Chalmers, who's the most senior government member from Queensland, said it will be especially hard to convince the Sunshine State to vote yes in the referendum.
Now, Sean, this is a really serious story. The former boss of the corporate watchdog, James Shipton, yesterday told how an abusive advertising campaign against him made him want to take his own life.
Shipton said a 6-month abusive advertising campaign against him by a billionaire defendant made him want to end his life, according to the Financial Review. He said 43 prominent advertisements featuring eye-catching yellow backgrounds attacked his character, his competence, and his integrity, and were published by a defendant charged with offences instigated by ASIC. The advertisements, and I'm quoting James Shipton here, the advertisements were soul-destroying for me, my family, and my friends. They were relentless. They cut me to the core, Shipton told a parliamentary inquiry into the Australian Securities and Investment Commission yesterday. He said, workplace bullying does not have to come from a superior or a peer. It can be perpetrated by an outsider. Moreover, workplace bullying can happen in the print and cyber media where it continues for eternity.
That is a really confronting story.
It really is. When I read that first, and you think of the people who held such important roles as almost being bulletproof. But of course, they're not. They're just normal people. And I was really quite taken aback by that story.
Yeah, indeed. Now, Sean, the share price of market darling WiseTech Global plunged 17% yesterday after the global logistics software company forecast lower than expected earnings, in part due to the need for additional investments.
Now, generally, WiseTech can do no wrong. And even after yesterday's massive tumble, it's still up around 40% for the year. The company reported a 9% jump in full-year profit. But remember, share prices move on forecast future earnings, and commentary from Chief Executive and founder Richard White disappointed investors. Growth in revenue and earnings will come in lower than forecast, in part because WiseTech made a couple of big acquisitions over the past year. They've really squeezed margins. They need more money. White, in response to the investors' concerns, said WiseTech often bought low-margin businesses and turned them into high-margin businesses, and that's what's going on now.
Around 1.3 million Australian women and more than 400,000 men were still subjected to sexual harassment in the last 12 months. Sean, this is according to data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
While inappropriate comments about their body or sex life was the most widely reported type of sexual harassment reported by women, around 400,000 were subject to unwanted touching or grabbing, according to a report in The Australian. And new ABS data on sexual violence finds no similar decline in prevalence, with 1.9% of women saying they experienced sexual violence in 2021, up from 1.2% in 2012 and 1.8% in 2016. Overall, 2.2 million, or more than 20% of women, experienced one or more incidents of sexual violence since the age of 15. Young women aged 18 to 24, the most likely to report being subjected to both sexual violence and harassment, and women who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual or queer are 5 times more likely to have experienced sexual violence than heterosexual women.
Now, Sean, we talk a fair bit about Domino's. We mentioned this at the top of the show. And we've spoken to Domino's pizza boss, Don May, on the podcast previously. And yesterday, he said that the company made a mistake lifting prices too much to keep up with inflation and has promised no more price hikes for the rest of this year in an effort to grab back market share.
So the price increases, which were done to alleviate the impact of 10% plus increases in food and energy costs, didn't help the bottom line, with Domino's net profit for the last financial year tumbling 74% to just $41 million. As May said, Domino's lost market share to burgers. The rise of food delivery companies and intense competition from players such as McDonald's really hurt Domino's. Yesterday, May said the company will axe about 20% of its support staff, and the decision to reposition Domino's into a better value proposition is already paying off. Domino's share price jumped more than 12% yesterday to close above $53 a share. Mind you, that's well below its COVID peak of more than $160 a share.
Oil and gas giant Santos posted a 32% drop in first half profit on lower production and prices, but that didn't stop it from lifting its dividend.
It didn't. Net profit for the 6 months to the end of June came in at $1.2 billion. Chief Executive Kevin Gallagher said Santos is operating in an ever-challenging macro environment. Santos had already informed the market that volumes were down and prices came off from their post-Ukraine invasion spike. When it comes to new projects, Santos is still consulting about its Barossa gas project in the Timor Sea. That one's fairly controversial. No update in its efforts to sell its stake in a Papua New Guinea LNG business. And Gallagher said Santos is expanding work in its energy solutions business. That's the business that focuses on cleaner fuels and decarbonisation. Its carbon capture and storage project at its Moomba gas site in South Australia's north is due online next year.
Now, I know there's a certain degree of risk in asking you this because it could be a very, very lengthy answer. Any other profits worth a mention, Sean?
Michael, hundreds of profits worth a mention. I'll only talk about 3. The Lottery Corporation, which demerged from Tabcorp in May last year, reported a 24% fall in net profit with lower than expected revenue from jackpot games, things like Powerball and Oz Lotto. People aren't buying them as much. Chief Executive Sue van der Meer also said the aggressive marketing from offshore lotteries hadn't really had a financial impact on the group, the Lottery Corporation itself, but she said the advertising push was concerning news agencies because they take a cut from local competitions, but not from those international competitions. Another one, global engineering group Woolies plans to use automation and digitization to boost profit margins after losses on the sale of a North American business caused annual net profit to slide 78%. Ouch. And one I kind of thought was interesting, IDP Education has benefited from the surge in international students. They're back, of course. Last financial year, its profit or its revenue was up nearly 25%. Its share price rose nearly 10% yesterday as a result.
All right, let's turn to international news now. And Sean, this next story. Okay, so a little bit of context here. It's about the BRICS countries, BRICS countries, which are, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. While you were away, there was a story about the upcoming kind of meeting of the BRICS countries. And our colleague, Jennifer Duke, who was filling in for you, did a bit of a trivia quiz. You know how you often kind of will quiz me on something. And she said, Michael, without warning, what does BRICS stand for? Which countries are in BRICS? And I'm only doing this in the interest of self-reporting because if I don't, she will dob on me at some point. I couldn't figure out what the C stood for in BRICS, and I nominated Canada.
Ooh.
And anyway, she thought that was hilarious and has continued to mock me. She goes, hey, remember that time that you said Canada was in BRICS? And it's one of those kind of, I suppose, geopolitical nerd jokes that I don't think she'll ever let me forget it. But now I would be able to answer that at any pub trivia night. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. South Africa is really the only one that kind of stands out as not being expected. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I totally. So when I think of BRICS, I do think of Brazil, Russia, India, China. Yeah, South Africa is definitely the odd one out. I agree.
Yeah.
Mind you, Canada would be even more odd because that's actually a developed.
I know, but I was under pressure, and sometimes I cannot perform under pressure, and that was one of those moments. Anyway, speaking of these BRICS countries, the leaders met yesterday to plot the future course of the bloc of developing nations. But I suppose, as you'd kind of expect, divisions rather quickly emerged.
Yes, no surprises. Plenty of heightened tensions after the Ukraine war and Beijing's growing rivalry with the United States. Basically, those sorts of issues have pushed China and Russia to seek to strengthen BRICS. Now, Vladimir Putin obviously isn't leaving Russia at the moment. He's considered a war criminal, so he's not going to step outside the country. He attended the meeting virtually. Russia and China want to use the meeting in Johannesburg in South Africa to bolster the grouping into a counterweight to Western dominance of global institutions, according to Reuters. Meanwhile, Australia is looking to advance talks on several crucial trade deals when the G20 ministers meet in India next month.
Sean, the Panama Canal is suffering from climate change, with shrinking water levels forcing ships to part load in order to navigate the waterway.
Yeah. So vessels have been waiting almost 4 days on average at the waterway. Of course, it creates a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Now, according to Bloomberg, many have been forced to lighten their load to sit higher in the water. Some ships have even had delays of as many as 20 days. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to do, is to get rid of cargo. The canal, of course, is vital for global trade. It allows through more than 500 million tonnes of cargo annually. It's not just the Panama Canal who's suffering here. So low water levels have also hit the Rhine River in Europe. That's hurt trade. Similarly, the Amazon in Brazil.
All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. You're speaking today with Dia Jolly, Chief Product Officer at Xero, which is a supporter of Fear and Greed.
Yep, all about what small business need and want, particularly around digitisation, cash flow, that type of thing.
Yeah, it's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And don't forget as well to check out the new episode of How Do They Afford That, which came out yesterday. This week's episode is all about how to get ahead if you're a low-income earner. It's a really interesting episode. You'll find that one wherever you listen to podcasts as well. And we'll also put a link in today's show notes. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Thursday, the 24th of August, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.